welcome all. My name is Stefano Occupinti from the Department of English and Communication, and of course the Centre for the International Research Centre for the Advancement of Health Communication. And this evening, it's going to be one of our first talks, I think, since last month, and it gives me very great pleasure to welcome my colleague, Professor Susan Dennison from Griffith University in Australia. She's going to be talking to us about, well, generally speaking, about the co-creation of a very large-scale, multi-level program that she now sort of basically heads as part of a centre, which I'll let her talk about. That's really focused in on preventing a lot of the negative consequences of incarceration in women, mothers. I've known Susan for quite some time, and so I was particularly keen for her to come to address us. Also because she began, to some extent like me, she began doing research on vignettes and very standard sort of social, well, not standard, but very typical social cognition type approaches in criminology. But in that time, it sort of moved enormously across the disciplines and across the levels of analysis. And so I thought it would be particularly useful for us to listen to her thoughts and ideas about how to really, sort of how to do this. So without saying anything further, let me then please hand the floor over to Susan Dennison. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks, Stefano. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you and your colleagues this evening. So it's exciting to be able to talk to a different audience, and I hope that you feel comfortable enough to ask some questions towards the end as well. Just in terms of that my background and my kind of foray into this work, I would say that this project, as it started off, really took me out of my comfort zone methodologically, in terms of we started to do work in a different way than we'd ever done it before as a researcher. And that was even after I had started doing a lot of mixed methods research. So I'm going to talk through this. It was not just different methodologically for me, but different in terms of how we communicated the findings along the way as well. So I think that might be particularly interesting to kind of talk through as we go through this seminar this evening. So I'm just going to share my screen now and hope that all works. And Stefano, can you confirm that you can see that?
Yeah,
great.
It's up.
Excellent. So the work itself is called Transforming Corrections to Transform Lives. And this was a project that we started about 2.5 years ago now. And so I'm going to talk you through the first phase of that work, which was really the co-creation phase. We are now in what we call phase 2, which is moving into the implementation phase of the work. So I'm pleased to say that we did get past that co-creation phase and get support for the second phase. I think it's important to kind of talk through how we got there. Before I start, though, I do want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am on today. So I am on the land of the Jagera and Turrbal people, and this is a traditional acknowledgement that we do in Australia in terms of understanding and paying respect to our elders past and present. In terms of the topic itself, I thought I should probably just provide a little bit of an overview about why the work that we're doing is focusing on mothers in prison. And just as a bit of a backdrop, over the last decade, the incarceration rate for women increased substantially. So it increased by about 70% here in Queensland between 2010 and 2020. And it's remained reasonably steady. It decreased a little bit during COVID, but it's on the rise again. It's substantially higher for Indigenous women in terms of that rate of increase, so about 130% increase over a decade for Indigenous women here in Queensland. So what we had as the backdrop for this work was a steadily rising incarceration rate, so a greater population of women in prison than what the state had dealt with previously. And this was a trend that was seen in every jurisdiction in Australia as well. And again, as a little bit of background, women in prison here in Queensland make up about 9% of the prison population. I understand that that is still probably lower than the proportion of women in prison in Hong Kong, which I understand is closer to 19% in the figures that I was able to obtain. So, but in terms of the background of women coming into prison, I think there's probably some similarities, even though there's a different proportion in terms of the types of offences that they're convicted of and their pathways into the criminal justice system as well. In terms of mothers in prison, we don't have any good data here in Australia, and this tends to be the situation worldwide in terms of collecting information about mothers in prison. So no jurisdiction actually collects this information as part of their work. So we don't have hard data on this. What we do have is some information that's been collected from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare from a much smaller sample of women coming into prison back in 2020. And there's also anecdotal reports from each of the correctional centres because they do ask women when they're coming into prison whether they have children. Unfortunately, it's just not recorded in a central database. So we know that about 85% of women coming into prison have been pregnant at some point in their lives, and we know that they report having at least, 54% of them report having at least one dependent child when they're in prison. Now, we know that this might not always be an accurate reflection of how many dependent children that they have, whether or not they have dependent children, because there is, I think, a fear of many women that if they report having dependent children, that may well be trigger a child safety investigation in terms of the whereabouts of their children, whether their children are safe in safe custody while the mother is in prison. And so there's that reluctance perhaps to disclose that, especially at the intake process when women are first coming into prison, are highly stressed, might be coming down from drugs and also uncertain of the whereabouts of their children themselves, and to kind of flag that with staff as they come through the intake process into prison might be a concerning thing. So we expect that 54% to be quite underreported, I would say, and it's probably somewhere more between 60 to 80% like we see in other literature. So, and they do tend to be younger at the age of their first pregnancy as well. And we know that about 2% of women coming into prison are pregnant at the time that they come in. In terms of women's experiences prior to coming into prison, we know at the point that they come into prison that only about 17% have completed year 12. So year 12 is the completion of high school here in Australia. So only about 17% have completed high school. So that's very low compared to 71% of other women in Australia. They tend to have high levels of unemployment. So only 14% of women coming into prison were in any paid work in the 30 days prior to prison. So that's incredibly low. And about 90% of them expect to be reliant on financial assistance from the government when they're released from prison. We know that a high proportion of them experience homelessness. So 27% were in short-term or emergency accommodation, and 7% of them were sleeping rough in the month before they came into prison. And 32% of women report expecting to be homeless when they're released from prison. So we have quite dire circumstances for women coming out of prison. And when we look at how many women are returning to prison in terms of recidivism rates being between 60 and 70% for women, we can see that a lot of that is actually related to insecure housing and other risk factors that they return to when they're released from prison. We know that they have high levels of history of mental health, so 65% of women in prison compared to about 25% of women in the general population. Really high levels of substance use too. So 74% had used illicit drugs in the 12 months prior to prison. That's compared to about 35%, 13% of females 18 years and over in Australia, and 61% had used methamphetamines in the 12 months prior to coming into prison. And that is hugely higher than the general population. So only about 1% of women over the age of 18 in Australia have used methamphetamine. So that's a stark difference for those women that are coming into prison. We know also that they have a high history of many of them have a history of violence. So more than 80% of the women in custody have been victims of some form of violence, whether that was abuse in childhood or domestic violence as an adult, or other forms of family violence as well. That can even be child-to-parent violence too. So, and we know that 72% of the women in prison have been in prison previously, and 9% of them have been in youth detention as well. They also have high rates of parental incarceration compared to the general population. So around 17% had had a parent or a caregiver in prison while during their own childhood. So there's a whole bunch of other risk factors, and this is my last kind of slide that I'll really talk about the kind of background characteristics of women. But in terms of that kind of intergenerational impact, we understand that for children with a history of maternal incarceration, more than half have had contact with the child protection system prior to their second birthday. This is drawn from data from Western Australia. It was a linked administrative data set. And we also know that they have higher rates of, once they're in the child protection system, they have higher rates of out-of-home placements. So that's about 27 times higher for Indigenous children, and about 100 times higher for non-Indigenous children compared with children who've had no history of maternal incarceration. You might be surprised to see that non-Indigenous children have a higher likelihood of being in out-of-home care compared to those who've never had a mother go to prison. But that's because there's a higher risk factor for Indigenous children being placed in out-of-home care more generally. So we know that there's higher rates of out-of-home care placements for First Nations families. And so the impact of maternal incarceration impacts families disproportionately, depending on whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. And then we also see that there are other detrimental impacts on children. So there's a whole range of impacts around stigmatization of having a mother go to prison and what that might mean in terms of children and families' levels of access to social supports, in terms of being able to disclose that information at school in order to obtain support from teachers, and understanding that it can often lead to a range of behavioural and mental health issues, both for children and those who are caring for children as well. There's poor school performance that we see. So we're only starting to get Australian data around this. So a lot of the data that's actually being cited here is coming from the United States, where they've done a lot of research using fragile families data and the adolescent health data. So national data sets that have included parental incarceration as a variable. So we know that there's poor school performance, but some of the data coming out of Australia now is also showing low levels of educational attainment, poor school performance, and higher suspension and expulsion rates as well. There's early school leaving, early pregnancy is a risk factor as well as that intergenerational cycle of offending and incarceration. So we see that cycle moving through from mother to child, and indeed that cycle occurs for fathers who are incarcerated as well. So just as a little bit of a depiction, this is why we became so interested in thinking about how we can actually break this cycle of intergenerational offending and intergenerational incarceration, and also understanding that it comes from a base of high levels of disadvantage that have accumulated across the lives of children and young people. So you have those precursors to offending that mothers have been exposed to, the developmental risks around child maltreatment, adolescent experiences of violence, mental health problems, substance use problems, disengagement from school, and carrying trauma through from childhood and adolescence into adulthood. And so you have all of those precursors that we know are risk factors for offending, as well as parents who are more likely to have engaged in offending themselves and potentially have been incarcerated. We know then that once they are in the criminal justice system, once they are incarcerated, that prison itself exacerbates those risks. So for women, they lose everything when they go to prison, generally, unless they have a partner who they are still in a relationship with who is able to retain their house. They generally lose their house. They lose all their personal property. So they lose that either because it's thrown out of the house and discarded and left on the front of people's houses to take, or it's stolen. So many of these women, because there are high rates of offending that relate to drugs and so on, they often have associates who are very much aware that that woman has been placed in custody, and so her house will be raided and her personal property stolen as well. So either way, she's losing personal property in many instances. She has a disruption to all her family ties, particularly in relation to her children, who will either be placed in informal care with other family members or through our department in terms of child safety and child protection services. But then also the stigmatisation that comes from having a custodial record and leaving prison and trying to secure housing, trying to secure a job, for example. So there's all those post-prison risks that then kind of accumulate. Women talk about returning to unsafe environments, so boarding houses in terms of shelter, where there's also exposure to a lot of drug use, and it's very difficult to turn their lives around no matter what goals they've set for themselves while they're in prison, and then also trying to reconnect and care for children as well, who are also vulnerable. So those post-prison risks kind of cycle back around to being precursors for subsequent offending, but they're also passed on to the children as well in terms of creating risks for those children and the commencement of their potential cycle into offending and incarceration. We see that carrying on through future generations. So what we were funded to do was to co-create a new model of service provision for imprisoned mothers and their children during custody and after their release. And so we were funded by a philanthropic organisation who were fairly newly established, but a substantial organisation here in Australia, the largest philanthropic organisation, and they are very much interested in breaking cycles of disadvantage. And they saw the criminal justice system as one of the areas that they wanted to focus on. So we were very fortunate to connect with them and commence a process that was actually quite a long process to get to the funding in the first place. Very different to writing grants, I have to say, in terms of obtaining funding through a philanthropic organisation. It was much more relational, and it was much more of an educative process around what was important and what might be needed for change as well. So we were then funded for an 18-month period to co-create this model, and it was us that pitched the idea that this should be co-creation, that we needed to work in conjunction with mothers in prison, we needed to work in conjunction with service providers and government departments in thinking about doing something differently. So what we didn't want to do was yet another service to add to the mix of services that already exist out there in the community. So there's lots of services out there that are all trying their best to support people coming out of prison or people while they're in prison. There's none that are specifically focused on mothers, but there's a range of services that focus on women. They all tend to have quite confined boundaries in terms of what they're able to do, and they're often disconnected from other services and government departments as well. So we really wanted to think about how can we understand what the gaps are, where the real challenges are, why aren't some of the existing programs achieving more success? And what can we do to actually enhance this space? So we were pretty open-minded about what we were going to end up with. So the purpose was to create conditions for families to thrive through a holistic system of practice that would support their wellbeing and social inclusion, and to demonstrate more effective, sustainable service provision that would be eventually be able to be scaled up by government. So we went in with those two scope, like broad scopes of the work that we wanted to do. And then it was a matter of thinking about how are we actually going to do this work. So to a certain extent, we were funded for the concept, and then we really needed to work through what the methodology was going to be and how we were going to do this. When we were funded, it was pre-COVID when the agreement was signed, and we were right in the middle of COVID once the funding actually came through and we were ready to start. So that was also something that we had to factor into how we were going to do this project. We drew on two main bodies of work in terms of thinking about the methodology of how we should do co-creation. There's a lot of co-creation literature out there, some of that which is designed for non-government organisations, small service providers and so on, to think about how they might want to work with their clients to design a project, or even with governments who might want to do a very quick co-design approach, which often happens within the space of maybe a month before they're ready to try and roll something out. And that wasn't the approach that we wanted to take. We wanted to make it meaningful for the people that were involved in the process. We wanted to make sure that we got it right. We wanted to include feedback loops and opportunities to revise our thinking and to kind of test ideas as well. So we drew on the implementation science literature, particularly that of Garte and the stages of implementation that she writes about. So this is just kind of a very simple version of the model that she has developed. And really we were thinking about that we're in this first step of this staircase, which is exploration. And that in itself was a really important phase for us to be thinking about. The question was, do we even need to be doing this? So whatever we come up with, we needed to be sure that this was actually needed, that we weren't just creating another program or a model that was going to add to the complexity for women and children to navigate through. And then we wanted to think about, not only do we need to do this, but how might it be done? So how could we ensure that we did it right? And those were kind of two questions that we came to right from the beginning, but actually we kept circling back to the whole way through the process. And it's still, that second phase is still one that we're kind of working through at the moment, is that installation. But we needed to think about how a program might actually be implemented in a very complex system. So it wasn't just a matter of how would we design the program, but how would we, I guess, implement it in a system that isn't just one system, the criminal justice system, and then all the other systems that women and children connect to as well, across health, education, child safety, youth justice, for example, as well as the not-for-profit. So those were the questions we come back to, and I'll revisit that as we go. And then that kind of told us what we should do, but it didn't necessarily tell us how we should do it. So we then turned to the double diamond method of design that was developed by the Design Council of the UK. And it's a method for designing systemic services, essentially. It's very much designed for the social services. It can be used across a whole bunch of design processes. And I know that those people who are in more design and creative areas also very familiar with this double diamond design method, but they also have written specifically about how to use it in the systems design area. And so we looked at this and really worked through being in this discover and define section of the double diamond. So it was really about working through a discovery phase. And in that double diamond method, they really lay out what are the types of questions that you should be asking in a discovery phase? What are the types of information that you should be seeking to obtain? And then how do you define the problem? They've actually just recently changed the language around this. So the discover phase has become the explore phase, and the define phase has become the reframe phase, acknowledging that often you might come in with a problem that's kind of you've predefined, but actually it requires a lot of reframing, and it might require a lot of reframing with the people that you're working with as well across the sector. So we were very much working through then the methodology that they set out, not all of the methodology. We picked and choose the elements that we felt were most central to the work that we were trying to do. So from that process, we really developed 4 series of workshops, and I want to spend a little bit of time, probably the next 10 minutes, kind of talking through what those workshops actually look like. So the first workshop was really focused on mothers' needs, and we wanted to understand what did mothers experience when they first came into prison. What were their own personal needs, but what were their worries and concerns in relation to their children as well? How did those needs change as they settled into the correctional environment? So from those first couple of days, as they moved then into weeks and potentially months in prison, how did those needs actually change? And then what did those needs become when they became closer to the release period? So when we think about release and re-entry into the community, what did that look like in terms of their experiences and their needs? And understanding that many of the women in our workshops had been in and out of prison a number of times as well. So we're able to reflect on what wasn't working for them as well, and what those challenges were that were bringing them back into prison as well. And then the fourth kind of area that we focused on in that first workshop was, what are their goals for the future? So we tried to kind of focus on what could life look like for them a year down the track, 2 years down the track from their release from prison. If things went well and they received the support that they needed, what were their goals for the future? Did they have high aspirational goals? And I'll talk through kind of that in a moment. So we used a World Cafe approach to this. So that means that essentially the World Cafe model is where you have a particular question that people on any given table will address at one time. So we created we had these 4 questions. So we really had 4 kind of main cafes, if you like, in a workshop. And women would focus on one of those questions. So people were often out of sequence. You know, some people were focusing on what was it like for them when they first came into prison. Others were focusing on what are their goals for the future. But then you spend about 20 minutes on a particular question, and we use Post-it notes. Women kind of were given Post-it notes. We had a facilitator on each table with the mothers that would write down on the Post-it notes if they wanted to. Women were also welcome to write on the Post-it notes themselves. And it was about kind of fleshing out in more detail. And we had some potential questions to kind of probe a little bit further about, to really dig deep into those 4 particular areas. And after the 20 minutes was up, we then circulated the poster around to a different table, and they were able to look at what people had already responded to and add to that as well. So at the end of about an hour and a half, everybody on every table had responded to each poster and added their Post-it notes to it. So in some ways it saves time, because you are adding to material rather than starting from scratch each particular time, but it still creates the opportunity for people to add their own novel experiences to it. Women were advised that they could either speak to their own personal experiences, or if they didn't feel comfortable with that, they could talk about what they know about mothers' needs in terms of what they've observed and experienced being in a correctional environment themselves. And that was to create some kind of psychological safety for the women that may not feel comfortable talking about their own personal experiences, but still had a lot of knowledge to share. What we found is that women actually did feel very comfortable talking about their own experiences for the most part. So this required a lot of cooperation from corrective services to bring women into workshops. So we did our first series of workshops after a long period of lockdown with women. So all the prisons were closed to researchers and in fact visitors for nearly a year and a half. We were very lucky that corrective services were very supportive of this work. And so when they had periods where they could open the correctional centres for a short period of time, bearing in mind that they were often not open to visitors during this time, so mothers were not able to see their children during the time that we were able to go in and do these workshops. So it was a very difficult and emotional time for mothers, and we really recognised that in the way that we were working with them as well. One of the other aspects of the World Cafe approach is that it is about creating a really welcoming environment for people. It is about acknowledging the expertise that people bring to the table. So it's slightly different to doing a regular workshop in terms of the type of environment that you're trying to create with this. We had meetings with corrective services about bringing in kind of morning tea for the women, having some relaxing music playing when they enter the environment and all of those sorts of things. And we were really fortunate that we were able to do those things. They were things that I've never been able to do in any other research project in prison before, but I think that we had so much support for this work with corrective services at as we were going through this development phase, that they were, and we provided a really strong rationale as to why these women were the experts and why they were part of the co-creation process, that we were able to do those small things that actually really showed women that we valued what they had to contribute during this. I feel like I'm talking a lot and I'm probably going to go way over time if I don't click through a few extra slides. So I just want to maybe just highlight just a couple of the findings before moving on to the next workshop. So mostly women were concerned about the whereabouts of their children when they first came into prison, and those women who'd experienced pregnancy and childbirth during prison also talked a lot about their vulnerability and isolation during that phase, particularly at a time when they're cut off from all their other social supports as well. That paper down the bottom is actually a paper that dives deeply into that experience for women who were pregnant or had young children that were residing in prison with them. So if you want to read more about that, you can go to that paper. For all the other research, we currently have a whole bunch of papers that are in review processes at the moment. In terms of what the key themes, mothers talked about needing support to maintain and their relationships with children, but also to build relationships with their children, to repair relationships. And they talked a lot about the loss of their maternal agency and autonomy. For those who had their children with them in prison, which only a small number of mothers are able to do, but for most of the mothers, they were separated from their children, and that loss of maternal agency was very acute. But even so, for those women who had children with them in prison, because of the rules and regulations of prison, there was a lot of difficulty in women having contact with child protective services. So here in Queensland, they're called child safety, and really understanding what orders their children were placed on, how they were going to be able to work through the requirements of those orders, how they might go about reunification with children, and then a lot of the challenges associated with returning to the community, finding suitable accommodation that would not just be crisis accommodation for them, but accommodation that would have suitable rooms and furnishings to be able to have their children return to them as well. It's a massive barrier for the mothers. They also talked a lot about having the opportunity to start healing and changing in prison. So there's a real lack of opportunities to receive mental health support, but also support to address trauma, and then any rehabilitation programs as well. In terms of the second workshop series, this was pretty different to the first one. I should say in that first workshop series, we also did workshops with stakeholders. So in total, we had 75 mothers across all the women's centres be part of those workshops in prison. We had 24 stakeholders, so people, representatives from different government departments and different not-for-profit agencies as well, who were providing services for women either in prison or out of prison, that participated in those. The stakeholders were very much aligned with what the mothers said. There was a few slight differences. The stakeholders tended to think that mothers were not focused on getting employment when they were released, but the mothers told us very much they want more support with education and training and support to get employment when they're released as well, or to even start up their own businesses as well. In terms of the focus on children, we separated the workshops because we really wanted to make sure that we gave enough time to understanding both mothers and children's needs. This was just, we drew on a lot of what mothers already told us about their children during that first workshop series, so we didn't need to go back into prison again at that particular point. And we focused on workshops with service providers that work specifically with children and young people. And we included, Department of Education and Health in those conversations as well as police, as well as a range of service providers that work with children who across agencies, including kind of youth services, homelessness shelters, as well as a specific service that works with children who have a parent in prison. And we created vignettes in these workshops, and those vignettes were really scenarios based a lot on what the mothers told us in those original workshops. So we just enhanced, in some ways, the complexity, not necessarily the complexity, because believe me, they were complex enough that we didn't need to add to that, but we told more of a story with it over time, so that there were opportunities to see how a child had been impacted by maternal incarceration over a period of time. And we really focused on how did service providers think that their agencies could actually provide support in these particular scenarios, and also how where were the opportunities to do things differently? So what services currently exist? Where are the gaps? Where do we need different services? And where are the missed opportunities in this as well? And so we gathered information through those kinds of questions, again, in kind of workshop format, where we had people sitting around different tables and working through a series of questions and their particular vignette that they'd been given. This took a long time to organise, I have to say. So probably the background to doing a workshop like this was that it probably took me about 2 months of calling different agencies, finding the right people to speak to, talking to them about what the project was that we were doing, why we were doing it, why it was important, learning a lot about their organisation and what kind of services they actually provide, and just asking lots and lots of questions. So often I found that I asked more questions than information that I was sharing, because I really wanted to learn as much as possible to inform the decisions that we would make around the workshop itself, but also so that I had more background about all these organisations and their work. And it was a really important way of connecting and building a relationship with all the different stakeholders and service providers. So that was about 2 months worth of work to lead up to the workshop itself, and to invite those people along to the workshop and have them kind of all turn up on the same day at the same time, and feel that this was a valuable part of their time. We had people fly from interstate. We had people come from northern Queensland down who were involved in, working in youth detention centres and so on. And it was also important for us to get government departments on board at the high level, so that they would release people from frontline service work to come along to these kind of workshops as well. So I don't want to make it sound like it was just a simple thing where people just turned up and it was all wonderful. It was a lot of work to get to this particular stage, and then to create those vignettes. And then we very carefully chose who was going to be allocated to which vignette, and who was going to sit around the table with each other, to ensure that we had really good representation for the focus that we had. So we had some vignettes that were focused on infants, some that were focused on young children having problems at school, some that were focused on adolescents who were already disengaged in school, and some that were already involved in the youth justice system. So drawing from the findings there, really the key things that came up was that there was real barriers to information exchange across service providers and across government departments, that often things are happening with young people or the young person's mother that only one service is ever aware of and nobody else is aware of this, and they felt that they couldn't share information across agencies about that for the benefit of children and young people. A lot of people cited privacy legislation as a reason why they couldn't share information. And so that's something that we're tackling at the moment, that there was a real need for young people to be able to navigate a very complex system. So not only to navigate their involvement, their own involvement in child safety or youth justice, but the education system, the correctional system in terms of having contact with their mother. We had stories of, young people getting a bus to a correctional centre because they wanted to see their mum, not understanding that they couldn't just turn up to a centre and have access to a visit with their mum like that. Really things that were incredibly distressing, but with young people really feeling kind of on their own, and often adolescents being left to care for younger children as well. That young people needed a single point of trusted contact that would help them actually navigate that system. And interestingly, not a single service or agency believed that they should be that single point of contact. They all felt that because of what they represented to the young people, that even if they were trying to support that young person because of their reporting requirements, or because of the government department that they're associated with, or even if they were a not-for-profit service provider, they felt that there was too much, I guess, conflict between them and other service providers, all in competition for funding, that none of them could really be that central point of contact, which was very interesting. That there was a lack of timeliness of intervention and support. And what we also found was that there was a mutual benefit to the stakeholders to come together under the umbrella of this project. So what we saw in the workshop was that they all started sharing information with each other, and exchanging contact details, sharing resources, which was a benefit from the workshop that we didn't anticipate. We then kind of moved to a model development phase where we did a workshop, but it was in-house with our research team. At that stage, we had 10, was myself leading the team, and then 9 other people that were part of the research team. This whole project took a lot of work. We had more than 50 hours of recorded workshop material that had to be transcribed and coded, and then really drawing from other resources. So we did a lot of literature searches, a lot of searches for evaluations of any program. We did an audit of programs in Australia that were working with mothers and children as well impacted by incarceration. We also drew on another project that I did to do a bit of journey mapping. So journey mapping was something that the double design method really suggested that we do. And this was kind of understanding not just women's experiences in prison, but actually what they brought with them before prison, to get a better sense of what kind of support was going to be really important for them exiting out of prison. So this is a very quick series of slides I'm just going to work through, which is the story of Kate. Now, she had her first child when she was 16 years old, and she had 3 more children across her 20s. She experienced excessive fighting in 3 of her relationships to 3 of the fathers of her children. So each of these children had different fathers. She experienced intimate partner violence across the span of nearly a decade. And during this time, she also experienced a lot of housing instability. So she actually moved house 27 times over the space of about 12 years, which is an enormous amount of moving. For much of that time, she had periods of couch surfing. So, you know, this was kind of moving from friend to relative to associate. Over the span of about 4 years, she did this for about 3 months every year, in those years that we see are leading up to her incarceration. She had high levels of financial crisis and debts in those latter years as well. She had, in terms of her health, she had major health problems that required some hospitalization in her mid-20s for about 3 or so years. But you'll see there at the bottom, she also had depression and anxiety for her whole adolescent life and right through her adulthood, which at different points in time she used medication for, and some of that was non-prescription medication as well, or other people's prescription medication. She had high levels of substance use. So it started out with daily substance use of marijuana, speed, and cocaine. She also had moderate drinking in her early 20s, but moving to 5 or more alcoholic drinks on a daily basis for her whole mid-20s, leading up to about 30 years of age, when she increased her drug use again, so marijuana, speed, cocaine, and moving into methamphetamines in those couple of years prior to incarceration as well. So so you can see here that we're not just talking about, I guess, challenges that occurred in the year leading into her imprisonment, but actually many of these had occurred through most of her adult life and even her adolescent life as well. And a lot of the substance use was related to trauma that she'd experienced earlier in life, and then also in relation to her intimate partner, her experience of intimate partner violence as well. So she was arrested when she was 34 and placed in prison. This is Lucy, which is her 16-year-old that she had. So this was the second child. And I just really wanted to point out that when we think about children's experiences of maternal incarceration, it's not just their experience of the incarceration itself, but what came before it. So in fact, Lucy lived with mum through all of her 27 house moves and all of the couch surfing. So she experienced a high level of instability throughout her entire life. She witnessed intimate partner violence. She witnessed the arrest of her mother as well. She witnessed the alcohol and the drug use. And we know this because we also interviewed Lucy as part of this particular project. She moved school 6 times in her late primary school and early high school years. And she was eventually expelled when she was 14 years of age. So at the time that we met her, she had been out of school for a year, and her grandmother had been trying to homeschool her, but it wasn't working. And her grandmother was in the process of trying to get her re-engaged in school. So we know that there's really complex challenges for mothers and children. And it's important to think about that as we think about what kind of support we're going to provide, and recognizing it's not going to be short-term support to address a lifetime of challenges that both the mothers and the children have experienced. So we took all of that information and we developed a model, and I'm going to talk very briefly through the model in a second. But we also took that model back and did a whole nother series of workshops with mothers in prison. So this was about 6 months later from the first workshop. So some of the mothers were the same mothers, some of the mothers were different mothers, and we went around to the different prisons as well. We presented them with these posters, which were summaries of what of the information that we took from them in the first series of workshops. So we were really conscious about feeding back to them that we had heard them, and we kind of checked with them that this was the information and that we got it right. These posters were then made available to them to put up around the prison, and the correctional agency agreed that we could have these placed around the prison. And we asked the mothers to explain these posters to other women who were in prison as well, who hadn't been part of the workshop, so that they could share the information. And it was really just as a point of recognizing that we understand what their needs are, and that this was the first phase of the work, and that we were then moving on to a second phase of seeking funding to actually implement the model. And then we talked through the model with them. So this was very different. We'd never kind of created posters, or we also created a whole lot of briefing documents as we went through this process as well. And they're all available on our website, which I'll provide at the end. So we were not trying to publish research articles during this process. We were trying to do really quick but thoughtful analyses, but also then capture it really quickly into a report, put it on the website so it was available for everybody, and reported back to corrective services probably every 2 months through this process about what we were finding, so that they could respond to it very quickly. I know I've probably only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to very quickly tell you that what we drew from this was that we needed to both develop a program that was going to address the needs of mothers and children, but we were also going to need to think about how the system itself worked and all the barriers that we had identified across the system. And for this, we developed what we're calling the Transforming Corrections Hub, which is really focused on systems change. And that goes back to that question of not only what do we need to do and do we need to do it, but how can we do it right? And we really felt that we couldn't implement a program for mothers and children we're in a system that is going to push back. And we really saw this complex system that is difficult to navigate for everybody, including the people working in the system, that we needed to create some fundamental changes there as well. And then we built research and evaluation around it. Very quickly, this model for the coaches, for the mothers and children, places coaches at the centre of the model. So you have mother and her children, and then every mother and child that's part of the trial going forward is given a coach, and that coach has a very low caseload. In the first year, the coach will only work with 4 mothers each and her children, working up to a total of 16 mothers over the course of 3.5 years. And their role is to be beside this woman as she, from about the period of 6 months prior to her release from prison up until 3 years after her release. So we're talking about substantial long-term support, but it's an empowerment model. So it's not designed to have high intensity support for the entire 3 years after release, but to be building the mother skills to be able to start to be effective in her own life in terms of the changes that she wants to make and be able to support her children as well. So the coach is really focused around the things that came out of our workshops, which is being a source of information exchange, providing continuity of care, developing a strong therapeutic relationship that removes the need for mothers to continually retell their story to a whole range of other agencies. And this was a form of re-traumatization for many of the women that came up. And so we're really trying to remove that process. It's individually tailored. And it's designed that the coach is there to provide integrated service delivery. So they're there to navigate the system for the women and to draw services together when they need it and for the types of services that they need, as well as providing one-on-one kind of coaching support. We call them coaches because they're there to support the mothers, but they're also there to challenge problematic behavior as well, just like any coach would in a sporting arena, for example. So, sorry, I'll just skip back. So the coach works with both the mothers and the children, and I won't go into the different levels of the types of work, but I'm happy to provide more details if you have questions afterwards. The hub has integrated service provision at its heart. So this is about actually what can we do across the system to integrate these services better, to integrate information exchange better. So that's our central goal. It's about bringing together all these different sectors who connect with mothers and children in one way. The things that we are working towards is developing shared understanding of the needs of mothers and children. We're working towards better integration of information, so information sharing across agencies, continuity of services, so for women who are moving from prison to outside of prison or across different correctional settings, but also across different agencies, being able to continue supports. What we see is that there is currently funding that is funneled in particular areas, and a child that needs a service their parent might actually need a particular service as well, but generally that agency will only provide the support to the child that they're being funded to. So this is about how do we actually coordinate and bring together the services that are also going to support carers, that are also going to support other siblings who are also impacted. And capacity to deliver services is the other thing that we're working on. So in terms of that capacity, it's about developing communities of practice that will bring together frontline service workers to develop their shared understanding and their capacity to work together and to understand the needs and to have links across agencies to start to pull together for holistic case planning. We're doing training with correctional staff to improve their communication skills with mothers in prison. What we saw was that their interactions have a real impact on women's sense of dignity and respect. And so we're doing training with correctional staff there. We're also developing training to work with guidance officers and teachers in schools so that they feel better equipped to be able to support children in schools, but also to bring mothers in prison into the conversations about the wellbeing of children in schools as well. And then we have a systems change board, which we've just established, and we've just set up our first meeting. And so that is a high-level board that works across kind of directors and deputy directors in government departments, across all the key government departments in Queensland here. That is about tackling those high-level policy and systemic issues. And so that we've had a pre-meeting for that. And so we have a series of briefing papers and discussion papers that we're currently developing that we will work through over the course of a couple of years with this systems change board to really try and leverage that support across the departments, but also within the departments so that they can feed support down to frontline service workers so that they feel empowered to actually share information as well. We have research and evaluation sitting underneath everything that we do, and I'm not going to kind of go into the details of that, but we are working through this process right now as we speak in terms of developing up all our measures, all our research and evaluation frameworks for every piece of work that we're doing for both the program and the hub, the systems change work. and it's enormous. So we've just grown to a team of 15 researchers right now, and then we're about to employ our program managers and our coaches and our program assistants who will work in the program side. So by the end of the year, we'll be sitting at around 30 people that are part of this team. So I'm not going to go to that slide. So we are currently in this installation phase. By January next year, we'll be in this implementation phase where we are implementing the program in corrective services, but we are already implementing some of the work in terms of the systems change board and developing. We've nearly finished developing the training for correctional staff, so we're hoping that that will be implemented in the next couple of months in correctional centres as well. So we're moving, in terms of the double diamond method, we're moving into this development and delivery phase, but there's a constant kind of loop happening in terms of working through government agencies, particularly corrective services, in terms of how do we embed this alongside their services, and ensuring that what we're doing is not just implementing a program, but a whole model of support. So they're actually working through their policies at the moment as well, so that they create systems change within corrective services to enable the continuation of this program and this model of working with mothers and children beyond the funding that we actually have, which is one of our kind of remits. I'm probably out of time, so I'm not going to go through this, but I'm really happy to ask questions about what these challenges have been in terms of co-creation, because there's, as wonderful as it is, there's a number of challenges. Some of those are around time, some of those are around finding the right people to work with, and understanding different people's objectives in what they want to get out of being involved in co-creation as well. But there's also a number of benefits, and some of those are, I'd say the one benefit that I want to point out is that in doing all of this co-creation work, we built amazing support to go forward and actually implement the project. Had we not done that, I don't think we would have got the funding to go forward and actually implement. So we were able to get, I'm talking about millions of dollars over multiple years to implement this over the next 4.5 years that we have. And without being able to speak to the amount of support that we had across the state from different agencies, but particularly corrective services, I don't think that we would have had the faith in us from the foundation to actually provide that kind of funding. So there's benefits not only in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of building those fundamental supports. And I'm going to finish up there. Sorry for going over time.